Hi, I'm Andrew Francis, and this is chapter 13 of my book Mission on the Outside. It's called Another Sort of Food. In John chapter 4 verses 31 to 34 we read this. Meanwhile the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, Has anyone brought him something to eat? Jesus said to them, My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. The disciples had gone off to get food. After all, that was the reason Jesus was left at the well. He was tired, hungry and thirsty, and being the caring disciples that they were, they offered him some of what they had brought when they returned. It's not surprising that they're a little puzzled when Jesus shows a singular lack of interest in their hard-won gains. Sometimes one wonders if Jesus is just being obtuse for the sake of it. He seems to be able to draw some deep spiritual meaning from the most mundane situations, and to be honest, I probably have more in common with the disciples when it comes to food. No matter how exciting spiritually things might be around about me, when my tummy is rumbling, it is hard to think of anything else except how to fill it. So when Jesus tells his disciples, I have food to eat that you know nothing about, they just don't get it. All they can think of is that someone has already bought him some food. Maybe that woman he was talking with had ducked home and cooked up a little something, or maybe she had something with her that she had shared with him. I mean, the fact that he had actually been talking with her would already have been inappropriate, let alone eating with her. Jews also wouldn't eat with Samaritans. But the reality was likely by this time the disciples had got past the ability to be further surprised by Jesus, who could really work out what he might get up to next anyway. But no, Jesus goes on to explain what he means, as the disciples are unlikely to get his message without help. They never seemed to understand Jesus, even when he was being quite straightforward, and would have less chance when he was using such analogies. Jesus explains that his food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. This is actually pretty strong stuff when you think about it. Jesus is basically saying that obeying the Father and completing the work that the Father has given him is even more important than eating and drinking. Of course, this fits in with other statements that Jesus makes, such as his call to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, even above concerning ourselves with what we eat and what we wear. Jesus seems to assume that if we get the God thing right, then all the other things will actually be looked after. Of course, for most of us, this just doesn't make any sense at all. We've been brought up to be responsible members of society. Likewise, depending on our background, most of us are told both at home and school that if we're to survive in this life, we really should aim to get a good education and a good job or career. Only irresponsible people don't do such things. Whilst in countries like Australia, social welfare provided by the government will ensure that no one will starve, nonetheless, few of us want to end up being dole bludgers or reliant on the charity of others. We want to be able to do the responsible thing and provide for ourselves and our families. And so, for those of us who are Christians, whilst we like the sound of what Jesus says about seeking first the kingdom, and even like singing songs about it, I suspect that few really take it seriously or consider what it actually might mean. I remember years ago as a minister in a church, we somehow always managed to have enough money to stick to our budget. I say enough because we rarely seem to have an excess. God had asked me the question regarding whether the church was the same as the kingdom. Whilst I knew the answer to be no, still the question caused me to think further about the implications. What would it mean to seek first the kingdom rather than the church as far as money is concerned? As I thought further about it, I realised that if I as a minister was going to take Jesus seriously, and if we as a church were also going to take Jesus seriously, then I really needed to encourage the people to consider not automatically giving their tithes and offerings to the church. Instead, I should be encouraging them to give their tithes and offerings to the kingdom. What this might mean would then need to be discerned by the people themselves, which in itself would be a challenge. They would have to take ownership of how they gave and distributed their money rather than relying on the church to do so for them. This was for many a really scary prospect. Likewise, the problem arose after my advice to the church to do this. The offerings indeed went down. A sacrifice was being made, and the usual stream of income that we relied on to function seemed to have suddenly dried up. Could God be trusted in this, or were we being foolish and unreasonable to expect God to provide? Amazingly, a couple of things happened. Firstly, people began to really consider how they used their money. One parishioner told me of seeing a person at the supermarket unable to pay their grocery bill, and sensing that she should step in, used her offering to pay the person's bill. Another example of seeking first the kingdom was when a group of parishioners heard of the death of a non-Christian friend. They realised his widow and children would lose their house if no one helped. They banded together and used their resources to enable that lady to keep her house. Years later at a party, the lady, who was still not a Christian, came and thanked me profusely for what the church had done for her in her hour of need and desperation. Secondly, despite having less income, we were somehow able to continue paying our way as a church. I don't know about you, but this sort of stuff really turns me on. It brings a level of excitement to me regarding use of money that simply giving to ever-growing building funds doesn't. Whilst filling our stomachs and providing more comfortable places of worship holds certain appeal, like Jesus, I have a hunger for something more. In fact, if the truth be known, I struggle with a certain sense of discomfort knowing that us Christians in the West live with a level of comfort and resources that my second and third world brothers and sisters wouldn't even dream about. So the thought of encouraging Christians to sow more money into ever-expanding church coffers strikes me in the same way as the temple system Jesus cursed, the system which took a widow's last 2 coins, leaving her without anything to live by. Yes, God might honour that woman's faith, but God doesn't appreciate the system that would rob her blind and then fail to meet her in her poverty, seeking to defend and care for her. I also know personally the challenge of seeking first the kingdom of God when it comes to finances. When I left the Anglican Church, I also left a regular salary, a church-provided house, car allowance and various other perks. Both my wife and I sensed that God was calling us to devote our time and energy to his kingdom. This is not to suggest that finding a regular job would have been in some way sinful or less faithful. We felt, however, that God was calling us not to seek a job with a regular income and not to even tell people of our financial needs. We were simply to do as Paul tells us, making our requests known to God. This has been one of the biggest challenges God has ever placed before us. It raised lots of questions. Do we continue keeping our children in a private school, paying school fees? Do we continue supporting the missionaries and impoverished children that we've supported all our Christian lives? I mean, these things made sense when we had a regular income, but now that we were ourselves missionaries, would it be right to pass on money given to us to support others? We had lots of questions and lots of fears. We ended up deciding to keep doing things we had always done in the past. Our children remained at the same school and our support continued for those we had always supported. In fact, at times we've been able to give away more money and be more generous. Likewise, there have been times when bills were not paid when due, and we've been issued bank fees over regular payments that required more funds than was held in our account. Such incidents cause much embarrassment, soul-searching and questioning concerning God and his goodness. Despite all this, we have managed to live this way for about 10 years. One of the lessons my wife learned early on was not to pray worry prayers. There was one situation where we had a large bill with no means to pay it on time. My wife spent the week telling God how stressed and worried she was. When the bill was paid in full and on time, she realised that she'd been praying not in peace and trust, but out of a fear that God wouldn't come through. She no longer prays that way, but now simply brings her requests and concerns to God, leaving them with him and trusting him to do the rest. There are times when we live well and have more than enough, and there are also times when we live hand to mouth, just barely paying our way. We are learning, however, like the Apostle Paul, to be thankful in all circumstances, and that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us, whatever our circumstances. Most importantly, we've been forced into a very real and exciting dependence on our Father and the trustworthiness of his word. We indeed have food to eat that few know anything about. As Jesus challenged the listening crowds, the reality is our treasure will always be where our hearts are. If we put our faith in our abilities, our education, our job, our financial sense, and any one of the number of false gods readily available to us, we may well miss out on the glories that can only be found in the will of the Father and his kingdom. Even now, some who are reading this may find themselves being challenged, like that rich young ruler, to take the completely irresponsible step of selling everything, giving the money to the poor, and following Jesus.